The frozen earth cracked beneath Thomas Brennan's knees like the sound of bones breaking. His hands, raw and split at the knuckles, clawed through half-frozen mud mixed with manure and old straw. The last Hereford cow lay on its side in the center of the pen, ribs jutting through dull hide, eyes already clouded with the gray film of death. She had stopped breathing sometime during the night while the wind screamed through the gaps in the barn walls, and Thomas had slept through it all, too exhausted to hear. He dragged the shovel from where it leaned against the fence. The handle had cracked 3 winters ago, and he had wrapped it with wire that now bit into his palms with every thrust into the dirt. Each scoop felt like he was digging his own grave. The hole needed to be deep enough that scavengers would not unearth the carcass before spring, deep enough that he would not have to see what remained when the snow finally melted. He knew the pattern by now. People slowed their wagons when they passed his property, pointed at the empty pens and sagging roof, spoke in low tones about charity cases and bad luck. No one stopped. Charity required surplus, and Hollow Ridge had none to spare. He finished the grave just as the sun reached its weak zenith, barely strong enough to cast shadows. Dragging the cow was worse than digging. Her weight had settled into dead mass, and his boots slipped in the mud as he hauled her toward the hole. By the time he rolled her into the earth, his shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the cold. The first shovelful of dirt landed with a hollow thud. Thomas worked mechanically, covering the animal that had been his last hope of making the bank payment. She had been thin all winter, too old to breed again, but he had thought if he could keep her alive until spring, he could sell her for beef. Thought had been his enemy for 2 years now. Thought had convinced him the drought would end. Thought had told him the debts were manageable. Thought had lied every single time. When the grave was filled and mounded, he stood there with the shovel hanging from one hand, watching the wind erase his footprints from the mud. The cabin waited behind him, as empty as the barn, as hollow as his stomach. He had eaten the last of the cornmeal yesterday, mixed with water and fried in the grease he had saved from a rabbit caught 3 weeks prior. 6 more days until eviction. No food, no livestock, no options. Movement caught his eye near the collapsed horse barn at the eastern edge of the property. He turned slowly, squinting against the glare of sun on lingering snow patches. For a moment he thought it was a bear, the shape too large and dark to be anything else. Then it moved again, and he saw it was a person, a woman. Her eyes were so dark they looked black, and they locked onto him with an intensity that made his breath catch. 10 feet away she stopped. The wind pulled at her shirt, revealing muscular arms marked with more scars. She was not young, perhaps 30 winters or more, but she moved with the grace of someone who had never known softness. Thomas found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "You are on private land." Her gaze moved past him to the fresh grave, to the bank notice on the cabin door, to the empty pens and broken fences. When her eyes returned to his face, something in them had shifted. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. "I know," she said. Her voice was deeper than he expected, with an accent that shaped the English words carefully. "That is why I came." The statement made no sense. Thomas shifted his weight, feeling the mud suck at his boots. "I have nothing worth stealing. I did not come to take. You have worked this land alone since then, and the drought has broken you." The mention of Rebecca hit harder than any fist. Thomas turned away, staring at the grave he had just filled. "Then you know I have nothing to offer anyone. You have land with your name on it, for 6 more days at least." She moved to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough that he felt the heat radiating from her body despite the cold. "You have a name recognized under white man's law. You have a house with walls and a roof, and you are still standing, which means you are stronger than you believe." Thomas looked at her fully for the first time since she had spoken those impossible words. Up close, her face held a harsh beauty, like something carved from stone by wind and time. Her hands, hanging loose at her sides, were calloused and scarred from work he could only imagine. "Wita." The question came out as barely a whisper. Thomas looked at his hands, at the dirt and blood under his fingernails, at the calluses that proved nothing except that hard work was not always enough. He thought of Rebecca, who had loved him despite his poverty, who had believed in the dream of this ranch. She had died trying to give him an heir, and in 4 years he had let everything she sacrificed for slip through his fingers. What kind of husband would I be? He heard the defeat in his own voice. I could not even save my cattle from starving. Naira turned to face him fully. She reached out and gripped his shoulder, her hand strong enough that he felt the pressure through his shirt and coat. The kind who buries his animals instead of leaving them for scavengers. The kind who keeps working when there is no hope left. That is the kind I need. Her touch sent something through him, something he had not felt since Rebecca died. Not desire, but recognition. They were the same, he realized. Both broken by circumstances beyond their control, both standing at the edge of extinction, both too stubborn to lie down and accept it. I do not love you, Naira said, releasing his shoulder. I do not know you, but I respect that you are still here, still trying, and I believe that if we work together, we might both survive what is coming. Thomas looked at the cabin, at the grave, at the empty land stretching away in all directions. 6 days, that was all he had left of the life he had tried to build. After that, nothing. No ceremony, he heard himself say. No preacher who will ask questions. We do this quietly, make it legal on paper, and then we work. Naira nodded once, a movement so small it might have been a bow. Agreed, I do not need promises of love or happiness. I need a roof and a name on a document. You need cattle and labor. This is an exchange, nothing more. When they come for you, Thomas started, they will come. And when they do, we will face them together, or we will die together. But we face it as husband and wife, which gives me protections under your law that I do not have alone. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow from the mountains to the north. Thomas felt the cold settle into his bones, felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This woman was offering him a lifeline made of barbed wire, one that would cut even as it pulled him back from the edge. I will need to see these cattle, he said finally. Need to know they are real before I agree to anything. Naira reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a strip of leather. Tied to it were several pieces of carved bone, each one marked with symbols he did not recognize. These are our family's mark, carved by my grandmother and passed to me. The canyon where the cattle graze has a spring that flows year-round. I will draw you a map. You can go tonight, verify what I say. When you return, if you agree, we will make the arrangement official. She held out the leather strip. Thomas took it, feeling the smoothness of the bone carvings, evidence of time and care. Why me? There are other ranchers, men with more to offer. They would ask questions. They would want to know my history, my people, my reasons. They would see me as something exotic, something to be owned and controlled. You, she paused, choosing her words, you are desperate enough to accept help without demanding explanations. Broken enough to understand that sometimes survival matters more than pride. And, she added, her dark eyes holding his, you do not look at me like I am a prize or a threat. You look at me like I am a person offering a trade. Thomas realized she was right. In all the shock and confusion of the last few minutes, he had not thought of her as Apache or woman first. He had thought of her as someone who might save him from losing everything, which made them equals in desperation. Where will you stay until I verify, he asked. The barn. I have been watching your property for 3 days. I know it is empty. I will not be seen. She gestured toward the collapsed structure. When you return tomorrow, you will find me there, or you will not. If I am gone, it means they found me, and you will forget this conversation. If I am here, you will have a decision to make. Thomas looked at the bone markers in his hand, feeling their weight. And if I say no, if I verify the cattle but still refuse? Naira met his gaze without blinking. Then I will move on and try to survive alone, and you will lose your land in 6 days. We both continue as we were until we no longer can. She turned toward the barn, then paused. But I do not think you will say no, Thomas Brennan. I have watched you work these 3 days. You are like me. You do not quit, even when quitting would be the mercy. She walked away before he could respond, her long strides carrying her back toward the shadow of the ruined barn. Thomas stood alone in the middle of his dying ranch, holding carved bones from a stranger who had offered him a future made of equal parts hope and danger. The sun was already sliding toward the western horizon. If he left now, rode through the night, he could reach the canyon Nara described and verify her claim before dawn. The thought of mounting a horse again, of riding through cold darkness toward an uncertain destination, should have exhausted him. Instead, he felt something he had not experienced in years: purpose. He turned toward the cabin to gather supplies, and as he did, his eye caught the yellow bank notice fluttering on the door. 6 days, that had been his countdown to oblivion. Now it was his deadline for choosing between two impossible futures: certain poverty or dangerous partnership. The choice, he realized as he pushed open the cabin door and stepped into the empty space where Rebecca had once made coffee and hummed while she worked, had already been made. He had been falling for 2 years, and Naira Whitecloud had just thrown him a rope. Whether it would save him or simply provide a different way to die remained to be seen. But at least he would go down fighting. At least he would choose. Thomas gathered his supplies in the fading light: a bedroll, dried meat that tasted like leather, a canteen, his rifle with 6 precious bullets. The horse he had managed to keep alive, a roan gelding named Rust for the color of his coat, was still in the small paddock behind the cabin. The animal nickered at his approach, hopeful for grain that Thomas did not have. "Long ride tonight, old friend," Thomas murmured, running a hand down the horse's neck. "Need you strong for this." Instead, as the cold night air filled his lungs and the stars began to emerge overhead, he felt the first stirrings of something that might have been courage or might have been madness. In the end, he supposed, the difference did not matter. Both would carry him forward, and forward was the only direction left. Behind him in the darkness of the collapsed barn, Naira Whitecloud watched him ride away. She had told him truth, but not all of it. The cattle were real. The danger was real. But the thing she had witnessed, the reason her own people wanted her silenced, remained locked behind her teeth. Thomas Brennan deserved to know what he was choosing, but not yet. First, let him verify the cattle. Let him make the choice to marry her. Then, when he was legally bound and could not easily walk away, she would tell him about the murder she had seen, about the tribal leaders who had killed the white Indian agent, not for justice but for gold. 3 days of measuring his character by his actions when he thought no one was looking. The way he had buried the cow with care instead of leaving it. The way he still mended fences that protected nothing. The way he had not run when she appeared, only assessed and listened. Now the gamble was in motion. By tomorrow, she would know if Thomas Brennan was the partner she needed or if she would die alone in this barn, hunted down by the very people who had raised her. Either way, the old Naira Whitecloud was already dead. What survived in her place was something harder, something that had learned the brutal truth. Trust was the most dangerous weapon, and she had just aimed it at the heart of a stranger who had nothing left to lose. The canyon revealed itself just before dawn, a deep gash in the earth hidden between two mesa formations that looked identical from a distance. Thomas almost rode past it twice before recognizing the landmarks Naira had described. 3 juniper trees twisted together at the entrance, their roots wrapped around a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear. Russ picked his way down the narrow trail, hooves slipping on loose shale, while Thomas gripped the saddle horn and tried not to look at the drop to his right. At the bottom, the world transformed. A spring bubbled from a crack in the rock face, feeding a stream that wound through scrub grass and wildflowers just beginning to push through the last patches of snow. And there, grazing in the early light, were the cattle. Thomas counted them twice to be certain. 32 head, not 30. Healthy animals with good weight, their hides marked with the same symbols he had seen carved on the bone tokens. He dismounted and walked among them, running his hands over their flanks, checking hooves and teeth. These were not stolen livestock or animals on the edge of starvation. These were well-tended cattle that had been hidden here deliberately, protected from both white ranchers and Apache raids. The spring explained how they had survived the drought that had killed his own herd. Water meant grass, grass meant meat, meat meant money. Thomas sat on a flat rock near the spring and pulled out the dried meat he had brought, chewing slowly while he watched the cattle move through the canyon. Naira had told the truth about this much. The question was whether the rest of her story held water, or if she had simply lured him away from the ranch to rob what little remained. The sun climbed higher, warming the canyon floor. Thomas filled his canteen from the spring, the water so cold it made his teeth ache. He thought about Rebecca, about the promises he had made to give her a good life, a full table, children who would inherit something worth having. He had failed on every count. The ranch had broken him the way it broke most men who tried to wrestle prosperity from land that preferred to stay wild. But these cattle represented a second chance, a resurrection he had not earned but might still claim. 32 head. With proper care and breeding, that could become Psalm 60 in 2 years, 104. The banknote could be paid. The ranch could be rebuilt. Everything Rebecca had died believing in could still become real. If he was willing to tie his fate to a woman who was being hunted by her own people, if he was willing to become the legal husband of someone he did not know and could not predict, if he was willing to trade his isolation for a partnership that might cost him his life. Thomas stood and brushed the dirt from his trousers. The choice had been made the moment Naira spoke her impossible proposal. He had just needed to verify that she had not been lying or insane. Now, with the evidence grazing before him, the path forward became simple and terrible. Trust or die alone. He mounted Rust and turned back toward the canyon entrance. The ride home took most of the day, the horse tired from 2 nights without proper rest, the rider exhausted from questions that had no comfortable answers. By the time the ranch came into view, the sun hung low and red behind broken clouds. The barn still stood collapsed. The cabin still wore its yellow notice. But now Thomas saw them differently, not as monuments to failure, but as structures waiting to be rebuilt by someone who had help. The weight of solitude that had crushed him for 4 years felt suddenly negotiable, a burden that might be shared. Naira stepped out from the barn shadows as he dismounted. She had not fled. She had not lied. She stood there in the fading light, waiting for his verdict with the same calm intensity she had shown yesterday. Thomas pulled the bone tokens from his pocket and held them out. 32 head. Good weight. The spring runs clean. She took the tokens back, her fingers brushing his for a brief moment. Then you accept? I accept. The words felt strange in his mouth, like a language he had forgotten and was suddenly forced to speak again. But I need to know what you witnessed. What makes them hunt you? Naira looked toward the horizon where the last light was bleeding from the sky. After we are married, after my name is legally tied to yours and recorded in the county office, then I will tell you everything, and you can decide if you want to fight beside me or send me away. But the law will already recognize our marriage, which means you cannot be forced to testify against me, and I cannot be easily taken without bringing you into it. The calculation in her voice was not cold, just practical. Thomas recognized it as the same math he had been doing since his first crop failed. Figure out what can be controlled, except what cannot, survive the space between. Tomorrow, then, we ride to Hollow Ridge and find whoever can make this legal. Naira nodded. No church, no announcement, just the county clerk and witnesses who will not ask questions. The clerk is Samuel Morrison. He drinks, needs money, and has signed marriage certificates for drifters without asking their history. I know because he married Rebecca and me 6 years ago. The memory came with less pain than usual, as if making room for this new reality required releasing some hold on the old one. They stood in silence while the stars emerged overhead. Finally, Naira spoke again, her voice softer than before. I will earn this. The cattle, the labor, the partnership. I am not here to take without giving. Forward was the only direction, and Naira Whitecloud was the compass pointing the way. The ride to Hollow Ridge took 2 hours. Thomas and Naira sat their horses in silence, both scanning the horizon for threats neither mentioned aloud. The town appeared as a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a dirt road that turned to mud whenever it rained. A few people moved about their morning business, hauling water, sweeping porches, heading toward the general store. Thomas felt their eyes follow him and Naira as they rode past. A white rancher and an Apache woman, riding together, both too serious to be simply traveling in the same direction. By nightfall, the whole town would be whispering theories. By the end of the week, those theories would harden into facts, true or not. The county office occupied half of a building that also housed the land surveyor and a lawyer who had not practiced law in 5 years due to problems with whiskey. Samuel Morrison sat behind a desk piled with papers. his collar stained and his eyes red from drink or lack of sleep. He looked up when they entered, squinted at Thomas, then registered Naira with an expression that went from surprise to calculation. Thomas laid $2 silver on the desk, more than the fee required but enough to buy discretion. "We need a marriage license. Today. No waiting, no questions." Morrison swept the coins into his pocket. "Names?" "Thomas James Brennan and Naira Whitecloud." The clerk paused, his pen hovering over the ledger. "Indian name. That legal?" "Legal enough," Thomas answered, his voice flat. "You going to refuse?" Morrison shrugged and began writing. "Your business, not mine. Need 2 witnesses, though. That is the law I cannot bend." Thomas had anticipated this. "Go to the saloon, find Jacob and Henry, tell them Thomas Brennan will pay them each $1 to come sign a paper. They will come." The clerk sent his assistant, a boy of maybe 14 who looked pleased to have an errand. While they waited, Naira stood near the window, her back to the wall, her eyes tracking everyone who passed outside. The posture of someone who had learned to always know the exits. Jacob and Henry arrived smelling of morning beer, their faces showing the wear of men who worked hard and died young. They glanced at Naira, then at Thomas, but the promise of $1 kept their questions unspoken. Morrison walked them through the words, the signatures, the date penned in his careful script. When it was done, Thomas pulled a horseshoe from his coat pocket. He had found it yesterday in the barn wreckage, hammered it roughly round during the hours he could not sleep. The metal was pitted and crude, but it fit over Naira's finger when he slipped it there. She looked at it for a long moment, then met his eyes. But he had also brought information about gold deposits found on Apache land, deposits the government wanted to mine. The agent was offering to make the land transfers look legal in exchange for a share of the gold. The 2 leaders, men Naira had known since childhood, were negotiating their cut. One of the leaders, a man named Swiftwater, had refused. He called Boggs a thief and the other leaders traitors. The argument had escalated. Naira watched from her hiding spot as Swiftwater drew a knife. The agent pulled a pistol. But before either could strike, the second leader, a man named Stands Alone, drove his own blade into Swiftwater's back. The killing was quick and brutal. Boggs and Stands Alone dragged the body into the darkness while arguing in harsh whispers about what to do. Naira understood then that she had witnessed not just murder, but conspiracy, a betrayal that would strip her people of their last valuable land. She had waited until the 2 men left, then crept to where they had stashed the body. In Boggs's saddlebag she found papers, land surveys, transfer documents already signed with forged marks, letters to government officials in Santa Fe. She took them all and ran. For 3 months she had moved through the territories, never staying long, always aware that Stands Alone was hunting her. He needed those papers destroyed and Naira silenced. Without evidence, Swiftwater's death would be blamed on outsiders or accidents, and the land transfers would proceed. Now, sitting across from Thomas in the cabin that was legally hers as much as his, Naira pulled a leather pouch from inside her shirt and laid it on the table. "Everything is here. Proof of murder, proof of fraud. Enough to stop the land theft and maybe see Boggs and Stands Alone hanged. But only if someone believes an Apache woman over white officials and tribal leaders." Thomas reached for the pouch, then stopped. "May I?" She nodded. He opened it carefully and pulled out the papers. Even with his limited reading, he could make out the official seals, the signatures, the legal language of land cession. And there, on one corner of a survey map, were dark stains that could only be blood. "You want to turn this over to the authorities. I want justice for Swiftwater. I want my people to keep their land. But mostly," Naira's voice dropped to something raw and true, "I want to stop running. And the only way to stop is to expose what I know or die with it." Thomas set the papers down. "Either path leads through violence. They will not let you testify. They will kill you before you reach a judge. Yes, which is why I needed a legal husband. If I die, these papers pass to you. You can choose to burn them and save yourself, or you can take them to someone who might listen. Either way, the evidence survives even if I do not." The weight of what she had given him settled like a stone in Thomas's chest. This was not just a marriage of convenience anymore. This was a death pact wrapped in legal papers and sealed with a horseshoe ring. Naira had made him the keeper of evidence that could get them both killed. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land he had been about to lose. 6 days ago, his biggest problem was bankruptcy. Now he was married to a fugitive and holding documents that proved government corruption and murder. The bank notice on the door seemed almost quaint by comparison. "How long do we have before they find you here?" Stans alone knows the territories but not the white settlements well. "Maybe a week, maybe a month. But he will come. Men who kill to protect secrets do not stop until the secret is buried." Thomas turned back to face her. "Then we use the time to prepare. We bring the cattle down from the canyon. We fortify what can be fortified. We make a plan that gives us a chance when they arrive." Naira stood slowly, and in her eyes he saw something that might have been relief or might have been surprise. "You are choosing to fight. I am choosing to stand. There is a difference. Fighting means aggression. Standing means refusing to run. And I am done running from things I cannot outpace." She crossed to him, and for the second time since they met, she reached out and gripped his shoulder. This time he covered her hand with his own, feeling the calluses and scars, the evidence of a life spent surviving. "We are partners now," Thomas said quietly. "Whatever comes, we face it together. That is what the papers make official. That is what I am promising you, Naira Whitecloud Brennan." Her breath caught at the use of his name attached to hers. In Apache culture, a woman kept her family name. But in white law, marriage meant becoming Brennan. She was now legally both, Whitecloud in spirit, Brennan in record. The duality seemed to settle over her like armor. "Then we prepare," she answered. "And when Stans alone comes, he will find we are not as easy to kill as he imagines." The next morning began their transformation from strangers to partners. Thomas and Naira rode north to the canyon, bringing rope and determination. Moving 32 head of cattle through rough terrain with only 2 riders took 3 days of hard labor. They worked in a rhythm born of necessity, Naira proving she could rope and herd as well as any vaquero Thomas had seen, her strength making up for what she lacked in experience with difficult animals. By the time the last cow was secured in the repaired pens at the ranch, both of them were exhausted and covered in dust. But the ranch had livestock again. The empty fields that had mocked Thomas for 2 years now held the possibility of regeneration. That night, they sat at the table and Thomas laid out the finances. With the cattle, he could pay half the bank debt immediately. The rest would need to come from selling breeding stock or waiting for spring calves. It would be tight, but survivable. Naira listened, then contributed her own assessment of what needed repair before winter came again. The roof over the bedroom leaked. The barn needed complete rebuilding. The fences required reinforcement. The well pump needed fixing. The list was long and daunting. "We work until we cannot work anymore," Thomas decided. "Every day we have before they come is a day we make this place stronger." And when we are not working? The question hung in the air between them. They were married by law, but strangers by fact. The cabin had 1 bedroom. The alternative was sleeping separately as they had the first night, which seemed absurd given the circumstances. Thomas stood and gestured to the bedroom. "You take the bed, I will sleep out here." When he woke before dawn, Naira was already up, building a fire, making coffee. The day's labor had already begun. The work became their language. Words were scarce between Thomas and Naira, but the rhythm of shared labor created understanding that conversation never could. She rose before him every morning, which wounded his pride until he realized she was not trying to prove superiority, but simply operating on instincts carved by a lifetime of vigilance. He learned to let her keep watch while he slept those extra minutes, and in return, he took the evening shifts when exhaustion pulled at her shoulders. The first fence line went up in 5 days. Thomas showed Naira how to set posts deep enough to survive wind and livestock pressure. She showed him techniques for lashing cross beams that required less nailing, preserving their limited supply. By the end of the first week, they had enclosed the south pasture completely, a boundary that declared this land was claimed and defended. During the second week, they tackled the barn. The collapse had been total, support beams rotted through and roof timbers scattered like bones. Thomas wanted to rebuild exactly as it had been, but Naira studied the wreckage and proposed something different. A smaller structure set into the hillside, using the earth itself as one wall for insulation. It would require less timber and hold heat better through winter. He watched her sketch the design in the dirt with a stick, her movements precise and confident. Where did you learn construction? My uncle was a builder before the wars. He made shelters that could withstand anything except the army's torches. The bitterness in her voice was fresh despite the years. When they burned our settlements, they burned his knowledge too. But I remembered some. Thomas nodded and began digging where she indicated. They did not speak about loss after that, but it hung between them, a shared understanding of how thoroughly the world could destroy what you built. The work was brutal. Thomas's hands, already rough, split open and bled. Naira's shoulders, powerful as they were, screamed from hauling logs that would have required 3 men under normal circumstances. But every evening, when the sun dropped below the horizon and they stood looking at the progress, something shifted inside Thomas. This was not his ranch anymore. It was theirs. On the 14th day of their marriage, Thomas rode into Hollow Ridge for supplies. He had been avoiding the town, knowing that his sudden marriage to an Apache woman would generate talk. But they needed nails, flour, and salt, essentials that could not be improvised. The general store went quiet when he entered. Martha Henderson, who ran the place with her husband George, stared at him like he had grown a second head. 3 other customers, men Thomas had known for years, turned to examine him with open hostility. Thomas laid his list on the counter. Need these items, can pay. Martha glanced at the list without touching it. Heard you married an Indian? I did. Heard she is Apache. Heard she is living on your property like she owns it. Thomas met her gaze steadily. She is my legal wife. That means she does own it, by law. One of the men, a rancher named Douglas Kern, stepped closer. You brought savagery onto civilized land, Brennan. Bad enough you were failing. Now you are dragging one of them into decent territory. The words were designed to provoke. Thomas felt the familiar anger rise, but pushed it down. My marriage is legal and recognized by county records. If you have a complaint, take it to the law. Otherwise, I am here to buy supplies, not discuss my private affairs. George Henderson emerged from the back room, his face carefully neutral. Martha filled the man's order. We do business with everyone who can pay. Martha's mouth tightened, but she began pulling items from the shelves. The silence was thick with judgment. Thomas paid and loaded the supplies into his saddlebags, aware of every eye tracking his movements. As he mounted to leave, Douglas called out, You are making enemies, Brennan, bringing Apache here while memories are still fresh. People do not forget raids, do not forget murders. Thomas turned in the saddle. My wife has raided no one. She works land, same as you. That is all. For now, but when her kind comes looking for her, they will not stop at your property line. You have put all of Hollow Ridge in danger for the sake of betting a squaw. The slur hit like a fist. Thomas's hand moved toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard before he caught himself. Starting a fight would prove their accusations, make Naira's position more precarious. He forced his hand to relax. Anyone comes to my ranch looking for trouble, they will find it. But that is my problem, not yours. Stay off my land and we will have no issues. He rode away before Douglas could respond, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The encounter had revealed what he had suspected. Hollow Ridge would not accept Naira. The town had long memories of Apache raids, of settlers killed and homes burned. Fair or not, she carried the weight of that history on her shoulders. When he arrived back at the ranch, Naira was working on the barn frame, fitting cross beams with careful precision. She looked up as he dismounted, reading his expression instantly. Trouble? Thomas unloaded the supplies. They know about us. They are not pleased. Did they threaten you? With words, nothing more. But it is coming. They see you as danger, me as traitor. Naira climbed down from the frame and walked to where Thomas stood. Sweat dampened her shirt, and sawdust clung to her forearms. I have made your life harder. No, you gave my life purpose, Egwene. If they cannot see the difference between one woman and an entire history of conflict, that is their failing, not yours. She studied his face for a long moment. You defend me. Why? Well, the marriage is just paper. You owe me no loyalty beyond what serves survival. Thomas set down the sack of flour and turned to face her fully. When Rebecca died, I thought I was done with caring about anyone. Easier to be alone, to fail alone. But these 2 weeks, working alongside you, seeing what we can build together." He paused, searching for words that did not sound foolish. "You are not just paper to me anymore. You are a partner, and I do not abandon partners." Naira's expression shifted, something vulnerable breaking through her usual control. She reached out and placed her palm against his chest, directly over his heart. "Then I will defend you the same. When they come, whether it is the town or my people, we stand together." Her hand was warm through his shirt. Thomas covered it with his own, feeling the connection solidify into something unbreakable. They stood that way for several heartbeats, the work forgotten, the world narrowed to just this moment of understanding. Then Naira stepped back, the mask of practicality sliding back into place. "We should finish the barn before dark. Weather is changing." Thomas nodded, but something had shifted between them. The partnership was no longer just survival. It was becoming something neither of them had names for yet, but both recognized as essential. That night, the first winter storm hit early. Wind shrieked across the plains, driving sleet that turned to snow as temperatures plummeted. Thomas and Naira huddled in the cabin, feeding the stove and listening to the world try to tear itself apart outside. The cattle were sheltered in the partially completed barn, protected from the worst of it, but the violence of the storm reminded them both how fragile their position was. Nature did not care about legal documents or partnerships. It simply tested everything until the week broke. Sometime past midnight, a particularly fierce gust slammed into the cabin, and Thomas heard the sickening crack of timber giving way. He grabbed his coat and rifle, Naira already moving beside him with her own weapons. They stepped into the blizzard and immediately saw the problem. Part of the barn roof had torn loose, flapping in the wind and threatening to pull the entire structure down. Without discussion, they both ran toward it. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked Thomas off his feet. Snow blinded him. Ice cut his exposed skin. But he could hear the cattle bellowing in panic, could see the dark shape of Naira ahead of him, already climbing up to secure the loose section. Thomas followed, his boots slipping on ice-covered beams. Together they fought to hold the timber in place, hammering nails by feel more than sight, their hands so numb they could barely grip the tools. The wind wanted to throw them from the barn, the cold wanted to freeze them in place. But they held on, driven by the knowledge that losing the barn meant losing the cattle, which meant losing everything. When the last nail was driven and the roof secured with ropes lashed to support posts, they climbed down and stumbled back toward the cabin. Inside, they stripped off their frozen coats and huddled near the stove, shaking from cold and adrenaline. Naira's lips were blue. Thomas's fingers would not bend properly. They sat close to the heat, shoulders touching, both too exhausted to maintain the careful distance they usually preserved. "You could have died up there," Thomas said when he could speak again. "So could you. The cattle are not worth both our lives." Naira turned to look at him, and he saw something fierce burning in her dark eyes. "Yes, they are. Those cattle are our future. Without them, we are back to nothing. I would rather die trying to protect them than survive losing them." The logic was brutal and perfect, the same mathematics that had governed both their lives for too long. Thomas realized he had been thinking the same thing, willing to risk death for 32 head of livestock because the alternative was a slower death of poverty and defeat. "We are fools," he said quietly. "Yes, but we are alive." Naira shifted closer, and Thomas felt the warmth of her body against his side. The boundaries they had carefully maintained since the wedding dissolved in the face of immediate need. When she leaned her head against his shoulder, he did not pull away. When his arm went around her to share heat, she relaxed into it. They fell asleep that way, sitting upright in front of the stove, wrapped around each other for warmth and comfort. When Thomas woke at dawn, they had somehow migrated to the floor, Naira curled against his chest, his coat spread over both of them like a blanket. Her breathing was deep and even, her face peaceful in sleep. He lay still, not wanting to wake her, studying the woman who had become his wife and partner. The scar on her face, the lines around her eyes, the strength in her features even at rest. She was beautiful, he realized, not in the delicate way Rebecca had been, but in the way that ancient trees were beautiful, shaped by survival into something both graceful and unbreakable. Naira's eyes opened, and for a moment they stared at each other, close enough to share breath. Neither moved. The moment stretched, filling with possibility and fear in equal measure. Then the stove popped, breaking the spell. Naira sat up, pushing hair from her face. The storm has passed. Thomas rose as well, his body stiff from sleeping on the floor. I will check the cattle. They moved through the morning routines with the same careful distance as before, but something had changed. The accidental intimacy of the night had cracked the armor they both wore, revealed the humans beneath the survival mechanisms. Over the following days, the change manifested in small ways. Naira's hand would linger on Thomas's shoulder when she passed him a tool. Thomas caught himself watching her work, admiring the efficiency of her movements. They began to talk more during meals. Small revelations about their pasts offered like gifts. Thomas learned that Naira had been married once before, to an Apache warrior who died in a skirmish with Mexican soldiers. She had been 17, had loved him with the intensity of youth, and his death had taught her to guard her heart carefully. The revelation made Thomas see her differently, not as someone who had never known love, but as someone who had loved and lost, same as him. Naira learned that Thomas had grown up on a farm in Pennsylvania, that his father had been a hard man who believed affection was weakness, that Thomas had come west to escape that coldness and build something warmer. The ranch was supposed to have been a place where children would laugh and love would be easy. Instead, it had become a monument to failure and grief. They shared these truths in fragments, never forcing, always allowing the other space to retreat. But with each small revelation, the partnership deepened into something approaching friendship, and friendship hinted at the possibility of more. 3 weeks into their marriage, a rider appeared on the horizon. Thomas saw him first, a dark shape moving steadily toward the ranch. He grabbed his rifle and called for Naira. She emerged from the barn, immediately alert, her own weapon in hand. The rider resolved into a white man as he approached, middle-aged and wearing a badge. Sheriff William Cade, who operated out of the county seat 30 miles east. He raised one hand in a gesture of peace as he neared the property line. Thomas stepped forward to meet him, Naira at his side. Sheriff, what brings you out this way? Cade's eyes moved between Thomas and Naira, assessing. Received reports about an Apache woman living on white land. Came to investigate. She is my wife, legally married and recorded in county records. Samuel Morrison performed the ceremony. The sheriff nodded slowly. Saw the records. That is the only reason I am having a conversation instead of making an arrest. Naira's grip tightened on her rifle, but she remained silent. Thomas kept his voice level. Arrest for what crime? Being Apache on restricted land. There are still laws about where indigenous people can live, especially if they are not on reservation rolls. Those laws apply to unmarried individuals. As my wife, she has legal right to reside here. Cade shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable. That is the letter of the law, yes, but I am getting pressure from Hollow Ridge. They do not want Apache in the area. Memories are raw from the raid 3 years back. A raid she had no part in. She has done nothing illegal. Not yet, but I am here to make something clear. Brennan. The sheriff's voice hardened. If there is any trouble, any hint that she is involved in criminal activity or drawing hostile forces to this area, I will find a reason to remove her. Legal marriage or not, there are ways around these protections if public safety is at risk. Thomas felt Nitra tense beside him. He stepped slightly forward, placing himself between her and the sheriff. There will be no trouble from us. We work our land, bother no one. If others start trouble, we will defend ourselves, but we will not initiate conflict. Cade studied them for a long moment. See that you do not. And Brennan, whatever you think you know about Apache culture and loyalties, be careful. They are tribal people. Blood calls to blood, and when her kin come looking, you may find yourself on the wrong side of a fight you do not understand. The words hit close to the truth Thomas already knew, but he did not let it show. My wife's loyalties are her own business. I trust her judgment. The sheriff tipped his hat, a gesture empty of warmth. Your funeral. I have delivered my warning. What you do with it is your choice. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of implied threats hanging in the air. Thomas and Naira stood silent until he disappeared over the horizon. He knows, Naira said quietly. Maybe not the specifics, but he suspects I am running from something. If anyone would believe me, it would be him. Where is he? Santa Fe, 3 weeks travel, maybe more in winter conditions. Thomas looked at the ranch, at the work they had done, the barn half built and cattle finally settled. Leaving meant abandoning it, risking everything to the elements and opportunistic neighbors. But staying meant waiting for Stan's alone to pick the time and place of battle. We prepare, he decided, finish enough work to protect the cattle through winter. Then we ride for Santa Fe, present the evidence, and force the situation into the open. Better to control the revelation than wait for it to control us. Naira nodded, and for the first time since he had known her, she smiled. It was small and brief, but genuine. You surprised me, Thomas Brennan. I expected a cautious man. Instead, I married a gambler. We are both gamblers now, might as well bet everything on one hand. They returned to work with new urgency. The barn had to be finished. Then we die trying to do the right thing instead of living as cowards who let evil go unchallenged. My uncle used to say that the measure of a person is not whether they win, but whether they fought when fighting mattered. Wise man. Dead man. The army killed him when I was 12, but his words survived, which means he won in the way that matters most. Thomas understood then what drove Naira, why she had taken the documents and run instead of staying silent. This was not just about survival. It was about legacy, about leaving evidence that someone had stood against corruption even if they did not live to see justice served. Then we fight, Thomas said, and whatever comes, we make sure the truth survives even if we do not. Naira extended her hand, Thomas gripped it, and they shook on the pact that would likely kill them both. But as their hands clasped, Thomas felt something he had not experienced since Rebecca's death, the weight of fighting for something bigger than his own existence. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. 3 Apache warriors appeared on the ridge north of the ranch just after dawn. They did not approach, just sat their horses watching, silhouettes against the rising sun. Naira saw them first. She went very still, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. Thomas joined her, rifle ready, studying the distant figures. Do you recognize them? No, but that means nothing. Stans alone would send scouts I do not know, people who can report back without being recognized. They stood watching the ridge for an hour. The warriors did not move, did not advance, just maintained their silent vigil. Finally, as the sun climbed higher, they turned and rode away, disappearing into the landscape like smoke. It has begun, Naira said softly. They know where I am. Now they will plan. Thomas felt the trap closing around them, the timeline compressing. How long do we have? Days, maybe a week if we are fortunate. Stans alone will gather enough force to ensure success. He will not risk failure now that he has found me. That afternoon, Thomas rode to Hollow Ridge and withdrew every dollar he had from the bank. The clerk, a nervous man named Peter Walsh, counted the money with shaking hands. Closing your account, Mr. Brennan? Temporary withdrawal. Need cash for supplies. Walsh nodded too quickly, clearly not believing the lie. Of course, I will note it in the ledger. As Thomas left the bank, he noticed men watching from various points around town. Word was spreading. The Apache woman's husband was moving money. Something was coming. He returned to the ranch and found Naira packing supplies with military precision. She had selected what could be carried on horseback, abandoned everything else. They fell asleep that way, wrapped together, drawing strength from proximity and shared resolve. When dawn came, they would ride into danger, but tonight, for the first time since exchanging vows, they slept as true partners, bound not just by paper, but by choice. Dawn arrived cold and merciless. Thomas and Naira loaded the horses in silence, every movement practiced and efficient. The ranch looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable in the gray light. Thomas paused before mounting, taking in the barn they had built together, the fences they had raised, the life they had started to create from ruin. Naira rode up beside him. Second thoughts? Just memorizing, in case we do not come back. We will come back, or we will die trying. Either way, we will not forget this place. They rode east toward the rising sun, pushing hard from the first mile. The plan was to avoid Hollow Ridge entirely, skirting south through rougher terrain to evade both curious townsfolk and potential Apache scouts. The route would add days to their journey, but stealth mattered more than speed. By midday, they had covered 20 miles. The landscape shifted from grassland to broken rock formations, offering better concealment but harder travel. Russ picked his way through narrow passages while Naira's horse, a paint mare she called Storm for the pattern on her coat, followed with the confidence of an animal accustomed to difficult ground. They stopped briefly to water the horses at a small creek. Thomas scanned the horizon while Naira checked their supplies. The weight of being watched pressed on him despite seeing no evidence of pursuit. "How many will Stands alone send?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice low. "Enough to be certain, maybe 6 warriors, maybe 10. He cannot afford to let me reach anyone who might believe my story. And if we encounter them on the road?" Naira's expression went flat and cold. "Then we fight, and probably die, but we make them work for it." The pragmatism in her voice would have shocked Thomas a month ago. Now it simply felt honest. They were 2 people riding toward probable death, armed with truth that might not matter and hope that might be foolish. Pretending otherwise would have been the real delusion. They mounted again and pushed deeper into the rocky country. As the sun began its descent, Thomas spotted a ranch house in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney. The temptation to seek shelter there pulled at him, but Naira shook her head before he could suggest it. "Any rancher out here will send word to the nearest town. By tomorrow, everyone will know we passed this way. We sleep cold tonight." Thomas accepted the logic. They rode another hour before finding a defensible position. A small canyon with only one entrance, high walls protecting 3 sides, and enough scrub brush to conceal a small fire. They made camp as darkness fell, rationing their food and taking turns on watch. During Thomas's first shift, he studied Naira's sleeping form. She lay with one hand on her knife, her body positioned to wake instantly if threatened. Even in rest, she maintained vigilance. He wondered if she had always been this way, or if running for 3 months had stripped away any capacity for true peace. His mind drifted to Rebecca, to the way she had slept sprawled and trusting, safe in their bed, because she believed Thomas would protect her. He had failed that trust when she needed it most, unable to save her from the complications of childbirth that took both mother and child. The guilt had carved hollow spaces inside him that no amount of work could fill. But Naira was different. She did not need protection. She needed partnership, someone to stand beside her rather than in front of her. The distinction felt significant in ways Thomas was only beginning to understand. A sound brought his attention snapping back to the present. Movement outside the canyon entrance, subtle but deliberate. Thomas gripped his rifle and moved to wake Naira, but she was already rising, knife drawn, eyes alert. They pressed against the canyon wall, watching the entrance. 3 shapes appeared, silhouetted against the starlight. Not Apache, the postures were wrong, the movements too careless. White men then, probably drifters or ranch hands. One of them called out, "Anyone in there? Saw your fire. Could use the warmth if you are willing to share." Thomas glanced at Naira. She shook her head slightly. Strangers meant risk, especially strangers who approached camps at night. But refusing might provoke aggression from men who could become enemies. Thomas stepped forward, rifle visible but not aimed. "Fire is small and we have little food, but you can warm yourselves if you keep your distance and your weapons holstered." The 3 men entered slowly. In the firelight, Thomas saw they were young, maybe 20 years old, with the lean hunger of people who worked hard for little pay. The leader, a sandy-haired man with a crooked nose, nodded gratefully. "Appreciate it. We have been riding since dawn, got separated from our outfit during a storm 2 days back." They settled on the opposite side of the fire, keeping their hands visible. Thomas noted they carried rifles and pistols, standard for travelers in this territory, but no ammunition belts visible. Either they were poor shots who wasted bullets, or they were running low on supplies. One of the others, a dark-haired man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, stared openly at Naira. "That is an Apache woman." "My wife," Thomas said, his voice hard enough to carry warning. "Married an Apache, huh?" The man's tone held judgment, but also curiosity. "That legal?" "Recorded in the county office. Any other questions about my personal affairs?" The sandy-haired leader held up a hand. "No offense meant, just surprised is all. Do not see many mixed marriages out here." Naira spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the tension. do not see many white men willing to acknowledge humanity in people who do not look like them. My husband is rare in that regard. The directness of her statement shifted something in the dynamic. The three strangers exchanged glances, recalibrating their assumptions. The leader nodded slowly. Fair point. I am Marcus. These are my brothers, Daniel and Joseph. We work ranch security, mostly guarding herds from rustlers. Lost our employer when he sold out and headed back east. Thomas introduced himself and Naira, offering nothing about their destination or purpose. The conversation stayed neutral, focused on weather and trail conditions, both parties maintaining careful distance. But as the night wore on and the fire burned down to coals, Marcus leaned forward with a more serious expression. You two should know there has been talk in the towns. Apache war party moving through the territories, hunting someone. Local militias are forming up, nervous energy looking for targets. It is getting dangerous to be out here, especially for, he gestured toward Naira, especially for Apache women. Naira finished. I am aware of the danger. Daniel, the one with the scar, spoke up. The talk says they are looking for a woman who stole something important. Tribal business. But some white ranchers are getting involved, worried about raids if the Apache do not find what they are looking for. Thomas felt Naira tense beside him. This was more than they had known, the situation expanding beyond just Stanzalone's hunt. Desperation was spreading, creating opportunities for violence that would not distinguish between Naira and any other Apache. Marcus studied them both carefully. You are running. It was not a question. Thomas considered lying, decided truth might be more useful. We are traveling on business, private business. With Apache hunters on your trail and militias getting trigger-happy. That is some dangerous business. Marcus glanced at his brothers, some silent communication passing between them. Look, we are not looking to involve ourselves in trouble, but we are headed generally east, same direction you seem to be going. 3 more guns might improve your odds if things get ugly. Thomas hesitated. 3 unknown men offering help that could as easily be a trap. But Naira surprised him by speaking. Why would you help us? You do not know us. Marcus poked at the coals with a stick, his expression thoughtful. My mother was Comanche, died when I was young, but I remember what it was like, the way people looked at her, at us. My father married her legal and proper, but that did not stop the whispers or the hate. When she died, he told us to never mention her heritage, to pass as white if we could. He looked up at Naira. I have been doing that for 15 years. Maybe I am tired of it. Maybe helping you is a way of honoring what I have been running from. The honesty in his words resonated. Thomas looked at Naira, saw her weighing the offer with the same tactical mind that governed all her decisions. Finally, she nodded. We travel to Santa Fe. There will be danger. If you ride with us, you may die. But if you are willing, we will not refuse the help. Marcus extended his hand. Then we ride together. At least until Santa Fe. After that, you go your way and we go ours. They shook on it, and Thomas felt the odds shift slightly in their favor. 3 more guns, 3 more sets of eyes. It would not be enough if a full war party descended, but it might make the difference between dying quickly and surviving long enough to deliver the evidence. The 5 of them settled in for the night, watches rotating among the men, while Naira slept in careful shifts. When dawn came, they broke camp and rode as a group. The dynamic changed, but still cautious. Over the next 3 days, they covered good ground. Marcus and his brothers proved competent riders and decent company. They asked no questions about the details of Thomas and Naira's situation, respecting the boundaries of privacy. In return, Thomas learned they were indeed the sons of a rancher who had spent his life building a small operation in Texas, only to lose it when Comanche raids destroyed his herd and his wife's death broke his spirit. On the 4th day, they reached the Pecos River. The crossing was treacherous this time of year, the water high and fast from mountain snowmelt. They found a ford that looked passable but would require careful navigation. Marcus went first, his horse plunging into the current and fighting across. Daniel and Joseph followed, both making it with difficulty but no disaster. Thomas started across, Russ strong beneath him, when Naira's shout cut through the rushing water. He turned in the saddle and saw riders on the ridge behind them. 7 Apache warriors, painted for war, weapons drawn. Stans alone would be among them. Naira would recognize him even at this distance. The river became a race. Thomas kicked Rust hard, driving him through the current while Naira plunged in behind him. Arrows hissed through the air, splashing into the water around them. One caught Rust in the shoulder, and the horse screamed but kept moving, his training and heart driving him forward, despite the pain. Thomas reached the far bank and wheeled around, rifle up. Marcus and his brothers were already firing at the approaching warriors, forcing them to scatter for cover. Naira's horse gained the shore and she rolled from the saddle, even as an arrow passed through the space where her head had been a heartbeat before. The Apache warriors spread out, using the terrain for cover as they advanced. They had the numbers, but Thomas and his allies had the river between them and the high ground. It was not much, but it was something. Thomas fired carefully, conserving ammunition. Beside him, Naira had drawn her own rifle and was targeting with the precision of someone who had grown up hunting. Marcus and his brothers maintained steady fire, their ranch security experience showing in their discipline under pressure. One of the warriors fell, hit by Marcus's shot. Another went down from Naira's rifle. But the remaining 5 kept coming, spreading wider, looking for flanking positions. They would cross the river upstream or down, and then the advantage of position would evaporate. "We cannot hold here," Thomas shouted over the gunfire. Naira nodded grimly. "Mount up. We run hard and hope we can outpace them." They scrambled for their horses. Rust was bleeding but still strong enough to carry Thomas. They kicked into a gallop, racing away from the river while the Apache warriors regrouped and prepared to cross. For 2 hours they ran, pushing the horses to their limits. The landscape blurred into canyons and mesas, the sun climbing overhead and baking the earth. Behind them, pursuit continued, the Apache warriors relentless and expert in this terrain. Finally ahead, Thomas saw salvation, a small settlement, maybe 20 buildings, with smoke rising from chimneys and people moving in the streets. They rode straight for it, their pursuers breaking off the chase rather than risk engaging near witnesses. The settlement was called Redstone, according to the sign posted at the edge of town. Population 73. Large enough to have a sheriff, small enough that strangers drew immediate attention. They reined in at the livery stable, their horses lathered and heaving. The stableman, an old Mexican with clouded eyes, took one look at the arrow in Rust's shoulder and called for his son to help. Thomas dismounted and immediately went to Naira. She was unhurt, but her face was set in stone, the near-death chase having stripped away any pretense of safety. Stans alone knows we are heading for Santa Fe. He will parallel our route, choose his moment to strike again. Marcus approached, reloading his rifle. "We need to hole up here for the night, tend the horses, resupply, figure out our next move." Thomas agreed. They found a small boarding house run by a widow named Elena Sanchez. She asked no questions when they paid in advance, though her eyes lingered on Naira with the same mixture of fear and curiosity Thomas had seen everywhere they went. In the room they rented, Thomas and Naira collapsed onto the bed, while Marcus and his brothers took the floor. Exhaustion crashed over Thomas like a physical weight. They had survived, but barely, and Santa Fe was still 2 weeks away. Naira's hand found his in the darkness. "I did not think it would be this hard. I thought we could move quietly, avoid detection long enough to reach safety. Plans break when they meet reality. We adjust. What if we cannot adjust fast enough? What if they catch us before we reach Whitmore?" Thomas squeezed her hand. "Then we die knowing we tried. That is more than most people can say." The words should have been bleak, but instead they felt freeing. They had committed to this course. Fear did not change the commitment, only tested its strength. How far to the next settlement? 3 days hard riding through open country. No real cover, no good defensive positions. If they hit us out there, we are dead. Naira looked up from her weapons. Then we do not give them the chance. We ride at night when they will not expect it. Sleep during the day in concealment. Reverse our pattern. It was risky. Night riding through unfamiliar terrain could cripple a horse or worse. But the strategy had merit. Thomas nodded his agreement, and within the hour they were resupplied and ready to move. They left Redstone as the sun began to set, riding hard under a rising moon. The landscape took on a ghostly quality, shadows deep and deceiving. But they made good time, covering ground that would have taken most of a day in just a few hours. Around midnight, they stopped to rest the horses. Marcus posted watch while the others tried to sleep. Thomas lay back against his saddle, Naira beside him, both staring up at the vast expanse of stars. "Do you believe in God?" Naira asked suddenly. The question surprised Thomas. "I used to. Rebecca did. She prayed every night, believed there was purpose in suffering. When she died, I stopped seeing the purpose. My people believe in spirits, in the balance of all things. I used to find comfort in that. But after watching Swiftwater die for trying to do right, after running for months from people who should have been my protectors, I wonder if the spirits are just stories we tell ourselves to make senseless cruelty feel meaningful." Thomas turned his head to look at hers. "Maybe meaning is not something given. Maybe it is something we create by choosing to stand against the cruelty instead of accepting it." Naira's eyes met his in the starlight. "You believe our choice to fight matters even if we lose?" "I believe it is the only thing that matters. Winning or losing is luck and circumstance. Choosing to stand is character." She was quiet for a long moment. Then so softly he almost missed it. "I am glad I found you, Thomas Brennan. Even if this kills us both, I am glad." His throat tightened with emotion he could not name. "I am glad too." They rode through 5 more nights, sleeping in hidden arroyos and sheltered caves during the day. The pattern worked. No sign of pursuit appeared, but the strain wore on them all. The horses grew gaunt despite careful rationing of feed. Marcus's brother Joseph developed a cough that worsened daily, and Naira's eyes held a haunted quality that suggested sleep was not bringing rest. On the 6th night, they crested a rise and saw it. Santa Fe, spread out in the valley below, lights glowing like a constellation brought to Earth. The territorial capital, seat of federal authority, home to Judge Marcus Whitmore, and their last hope for justice. Thomas felt relief and terror in equal measure. They had made it this far. But now came the hardest part. Convincing powerful men that an Apache woman was telling the truth about corruption that implicated other powerful men. The courts were not known for siding with indigenous witnesses against white officials. Naira sat her horse beside him, staring down at the city. "Once we ride down there, there is no turning back. We present the evidence and hope, or we run forever." Marcus and his brothers pulled up alongside. "We will go with you tomorrow. Testify to what we witnessed at the river crossing. 3 white men saying you were attacked might carry weight." Thomas gripped Marcus's shoulder in gratitude. "You have already risked more than we had right to ask. We finish what we start. That is how we were raised." They made camp one final time in the hills above Santa Fe. Tomorrow would reveal whether their desperate gamble had any chance of success, or if they had simply traded quick death in the territories for slow death in a courtroom that would never believe them. As they settled in for the night, Thomas pulled Naira aside. The words he had been holding since Redstone pushed against his teeth, demanding release. "Naira, I need to tell you something. In case tomorrow goes badly." She looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "You are going to say something you think will complicate things." "Maybe, but I need you to know anyway." He took a breath, committed. "I have come to care for you, not as a partner in survival, though you are that. Not as a legal wife, though you are that too, but as someone I choose to stand beside because being with you makes me better than I am alone. If we survive this, I want to offer you the choice of something more. But I will understand if you do not feel the same." Naira stared at him for a long moment. Then she stepped close, reached up, and pulled his face down to hers. The kiss was fierce and brief, tasting of dust and determination and something that might have been hope. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "I made you my husband for survival, but somewhere between the barn repairs and the river crossing, you became something more. I do not have words for it. My first husband was chosen by my heart when I was too young to know what that meant. You were chosen by my head when I was desperate. But maybe choosing with both is the only way to find something that lasts." Thomas pulled her against him, holding tight, feeling her heart beat against his chest. They stood that way for a long time, drawing strength from each other, building courage for the trial ahead. Tomorrow they would walk into the federal courthouse. Tomorrow they would lay their evidence before Judge Whitmore. Tomorrow they would discover if justice was real or just another story people told to make cruelty feel manageable. But tonight in the hills above Santa Fe, Thomas Brennan and Naira Whitecloud held each other and chose to believe that truth mattered, that standing mattered, that love built in the middle of chaos might be the strongest love of all. Santa Fe revealed itself in morning light as something more complex than Thomas had imagined. Adobe buildings clustered around a central plaza, church bells ringing out the hour, merchants opening shutters to display wares from Mexico, St. Louis, and points beyond. This was not Hollow Ridge with its desperate poverty and narrow certainties. This was a crossroads where cultures collided and sometimes merged, where Spanish mixed with English and indigenous languages created a linguistic stew that reflected the territory's violent and vibrant history. They rode into the city slowly, drawing stares but not outright hostility. Santa Fe had seen enough diversity to make one Apache woman less remarkable than she would have been elsewhere. Still, Thomas noticed the way people's eyes lingered on Naira, calculating threat levels and social boundaries. Marcus led them to a modest hotel on a side street, a place that asked few questions if you paid in advance. The proprietor, a thin woman with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled into a severe bun, quoted them a price that was robbery, but not quite extortion. Thomas paid for 2 rooms, one for himself and Naira, one for Marcus and his brothers. The woman's eyebrow rose slightly at the mixed-race couple, but she handed over keys without comment. In Santa Fe, judgment came more quietly than in the territories, expressed through pricing rather than refusal of service. Upstairs, Thomas and Naira dropped their packs and stood at the window looking down at the street below. People moved with purpose, conducting business, living lives that had nothing to do with murder conspiracies or Apache vengeance. The normalcy felt alien after weeks of constant danger. Judge Whitmore's office is in the federal building near the plaza, Naira said quietly. We should go soon, before Stans alone realizes where we went. Thomas nodded but found himself hesitating. Once they presented the evidence, events would spiral beyond their control. Courts moved slowly when they moved at all, and in the meantime they would be exposed and vulnerable. But delay only gave their enemies more time to organize. We go this afternoon. Give ourselves the morning to clean up, look presentable. Judges respond better to people who do not look like fugitives. They use the hotel's bathing facilities, washing away weeks of trail dust. Thomas shaved and put on his least damaged shirt. Whitmore looked up from the papers he had been reviewing, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His gaze moved across the group, lingering on Naira with an intensity that suggested he was already calculating the implications of her presence. Send them in. They filed into the office. Thomas took the lead, offering his hand. Your Honor, I am Thomas Brennan. This is my wife, Naira. We have traveled from Hollow Ridge with evidence of murder and fraud involving Indian Bureau officials and Apache tribal leaders. Whitmore did not take the offered hand immediately, instead studying Thomas with an expression that might have been skepticism or might have been careful neutrality. Finally, he shook briefly and gestured to the chairs arranged before his desk. That is quite a claim, Mr. Brennan. I assume you have more than accusations? Naira reached into her pouch and withdrew the documents, laying them on the desk with hands that trembled slightly despite her control. These were taken from Indian agent Harrison Boggs after he participated in the murder of an Apache leader named Swiftwater. The papers detail a scheme to transfer Apache land to mining interests through forged signatures and bribery. Whitmore picked up the first document, his expression unreadable. He read in silence for several minutes while Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. Everything depended on this man's willingness to see truth over convenience, to act despite the powerful interests that would resist exposure. Finally, the judge set down the papers and removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief while he composed his thoughts. These documents, if authentic, constitute evidence of serious federal crimes, but they also create significant problems. Thomas felt his stomach drop. What kind of problems? The kind that get people killed, Mr. Brennan. The kind that make powerful men desperate. Whitmore replaced his spectacles and fixed them with a penetrating stare. I investigated Indian Bureau corruption 2 years ago. Do you know what happened to the last witness who brought me evidence of fraud? No one answered. He disappeared 3 days after our meeting. His body was found 2 weeks later, throat cut, dumped in an arroyo outside Albuquerque. The case was never solved. The evidence he brought vanished from my office safe, though only 3 people had keys. Whitmore let that sink in. I tell you this not to discourage you, but to make certain you understand the forces you are challenging. Naira leaned forward, her voice steady despite the fear Thomas could see in her eyes. Swiftwater understood those forces when he opposed the land transfer. He was killed for it. If we do not expose what happened, his death means nothing, and my people lose their last valuable land. I would rather die trying to stop that than live knowing I was too afraid to speak. Something shifted in Whitmore's expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of courage he had seen too rarely in his courtroom. He gathered the documents carefully and locked them in a drawer of his desk. I will review these thoroughly and begin a formal investigation, but this will take time, weeks, possibly months. During that period, you will be in extreme danger. Boggs has connections throughout the territorial government, and if he learns you are here, he will act quickly to silence you before I can move against him. Marcus spoke up. What protection can you offer them? Very little officially. I can assign a federal marshal to watch them, but one man against determined killers is poor odds. My advice would be to leave Santa Fe, go somewhere remote, and wait until I have enough evidence to issue arrest warrants and bring charges. Then you can testify under federal protection. Thomas shook his head. We cannot run anymore. We spent everything getting here. Brennan, one more thing. You witnessed the murder of Swiftwater? Naira turned back. Yes, sir. Then you are the key to this entire case. The documents prove fraud, but without a witness to the killing, Boggs and his conspirators can claim Swiftwater died by other means. Your testimony is what makes this case strong enough to prosecute. His expression was grave, which also makes you the primary target. They will try very hard to kill you before you can take the witness stand. The bluntness of the statement landed like a physical blow. Thomas instinctively moved closer to Naira, his hand finding hers. Whitmore noticed the gesture and his expression softened fractionally. You care for her. That is good. She will need people who care enough to die for her, because that is exactly what may be required before this is finished. They left the federal building and walked back through Santa Fe's streets in silence, the weight of Whitmore's warning pressing down on them. At the hotel, they gathered their belongings and prepared to ride north to Hartford's ranch. But as Thomas stepped into the hallway, he nearly collided with a man coming up the stairs. The stranger was white, middle-aged, wearing the dusty clothes of someone who had ridden hard. His eyes widened in recognition when he saw Naira standing in the doorway behind Thomas. For a frozen moment, they stared at each other. Then the man's hand moved toward the pistol at his belt, and Thomas reacted on pure instinct, slamming into him and driving them both into the wall. The gun fired, the bullet splintering wood inches from Naira's head. Marcus and his brothers burst from their room as Thomas grappled with the shooter. The man was strong and fought with desperate violence, his free hand clawing at Thomas's face while his gun hand tried to bring the weapon to bear again. Then Naira was there, driving her knife into the man's shoulder. He screamed and dropped the pistol, collapsing as blood soaked his shirt. People poured into the hallway, drawn by the gunshot. The hotel proprietor appeared, her face pale with shock. What is happening here? Marcus kicked the fallen pistol away and knelt to check the wounded man. He tried to kill them. We all saw it. The man glared up at them through his pain, his voice rasping. You are dead, all of you. Boggs knows you are here. Stands alone is coming. You will not live to testify. Thomas's blood turned cold. How does Boggs know? The man laughed, a wet sound mixed with blood. He has people everywhere. The judge's clerk, the hotel workers, half the city. You think you can walk into Santa Fe and not be noticed? You were marked the moment you arrived. Naira grabbed the man's collar, pulling his face close to hers. How many are coming? When? Enough to finish this. Tonight, tomorrow does not matter. You are already dead. The hotel proprietor sent for the sheriff, while Marcus tied up the wounded man with bedsheets. Thomas pulled Naira aside, his mind racing through terrible options. We need to leave, now. If Boggs has people throughout the city, staying here is suicide. Hartford's ranch. We ride hard, get there before dark. They threw their belongings together while Marcus's brothers kept watch. The Santa Fe sheriff arrived as they were mounting their horses in the alley behind the hotel, a middle-aged man with calculating eyes who looked at the situation and clearly wanted no part of it. "You are leaving town?" he asked, his tone suggesting that was the outcome he preferred. "Yes, sir, heading north on business." "Good. I will hold your attacker for attempted murder. But I would advise not coming back to Santa Fe for a while. Things are liable to get complicated around here." And the subtext was clear. The sheriff knew or suspected who Boggs was, understood the political currents involved, and wanted no part of a fight between federal investigators and corrupt bureau officials. He would do his minimal duty and nothing more. They rode out of Santa Fe as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The attack in the hotel had shattered any illusions of safety. Boggs knew they were here, knew what they had brought to Whitmore. The race was now between the judge's ability to move the legal machinery and their enemy's willingness to commit murder in broad daylight. The road north climbed into pine-covered hills, the air growing cooler and cleaner. They pushed the horses hard, watching constantly for pursuit. 20 miles had seemed like a short distance that morning. Now it felt like crossing an ocean under enemy fire. Beside him, Naira was quiet, her hand resting on the knife she always carried. "We brought war to good people," she said softly. "We brought truth to people who can defend it. There is a difference." "Is there?" Hartford's wife did not ask to have her home turned into a fortress. His men did not ask to risk their lives for strangers. Thomas turned to face her. "No one ever asks for the moment when they have to choose between safety and doing what is right. It just comes, and you either stand or you do not. Hartford is choosing to stand. That is who he is." Before Naira could respond, shouts erupted from outside. They rushed to the door as one of the guards ran toward the house. "Riders coming, at least 20, approaching from the south." Hartford was already moving, issuing orders with military precision. "Douse all lights except perimeter lanterns. Get the women and children to the interior rooms. Every man to his position. Hold fire until I give the command." Thomas grabbed his rifle and moved to a window position. Naira took the one beside him, her own weapon ready. Outside, the darkness was broken only by scattered lantern light that created more shadows than illumination. The waiting was its own torture, every second stretching as they listened for sounds of approach. Then they came, not charging but advancing carefully in a coordinated line. Even in the darkness, Thomas could see they were a mixed group, white men and Apache warriors, united by Boggs's money and Stans Alone's desperation. The coalition represented everything wrong with the territories: violence for profit, old hatreds weaponized for new crimes. Hartford's voice rang out strong and clear. "You are trespassing on private property. Identify yourselves and state your business." A man stepped forward into the lantern light. Harrison Boggs himself, Thomas realized, recognizing him from descriptions in the documents. Boggs stepped back into the darkness, and his voice rose to address his men. "The colonel is harboring criminals. We are authorized to use force to execute our duty. Take them alive, if possible. Dead, if necessary." The attack came instantly. Gunfire erupted from the raiders, bullets smashing through windows and splintering wood. Hartford's men returned fire with devastating precision, their military training evident in every coordinated volley. The courtyard became a kill zone, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness in staccato bursts. Thomas fired carefully, aware that every bullet had to count. Beside him, Naira's rifle cracked steadily, her shots finding targets with grim efficiency. Outside, men screamed and fell, the coordinated attack dissolving into chaos as Hartford's defense proved more formidable than expected. But the raiders had numbers and desperation. Some circled wide, looking for weak points in the perimeter. Others pressed forward under a covering fire, trying to reach the house itself. A group of Apache warriors broke through the eastern fence line, moving with the tactical sophistication of men trained in guerrilla warfare. Hartford saw the breach and redirected his forces, but it opened a gap that Boggs's white gunmen exploited. 3 of them reached the main house, kicking in a side door. Thomas heard Maria Hartford scream from somewhere in the interior. He turned from the window and ran toward the sound, Naira right behind him. They found the raiders in the hallway, weapons drawn, advancing toward the room where the women and children sheltered. One of them saw Thomas and fired. The bullet gouged a line across Thomas's ribs, burning pain that staggered him but did not drop him. Then Naira was there, moving with the brutal grace of an Apache warrior, her knife finding the shooter's throat before he could fire again. The second raider swung his rifle toward her, but Thomas tackled him, driving them both into the wall. They grappled viciously until a gunshot ended it at Marcus, appearing from a side room, his pistol smoking. The third raider raised his hands in surrender, his face pale with terror. Hartford arrived, his own weapon trained on the man. "Tie him up. We will need witnesses to testify about what happened here." Outside, the gunfire was tapering off. The raiders, having lost too many men to Hartford's organized defense, were retreating. Thomas staggered to the window and watched them flee into the darkness, carrying wounded and leaving their dead behind. When silence finally settled, Hartford did a count. 3 of his men wounded, none killed. 8 raiders dead in the courtyard, 5 more likely to die from their wounds. The colonel's face was grim as he surveyed the carnage. "They will come back. This was just the first attempt. Boggs cannot afford to let you testify now that he has committed to violence." Thomas pressed a hand to his bleeding side, feeling the burn of the bullet graze. "Then we need to get word to Whitmore, have him move faster on the investigation." "Already done. I sent a rider to Santa Fe the moment the shooting started. But legal proceedings take time, and time is what you do not have." Hartford looked at Naira with something approaching respect. "You fight well, Mrs. Brennan, like someone trained for war." "I was raised Apache. War was part of our education." "Then you understand we are in a siege situation now. They will regroup, bring more men, try again. We can hold for a while, but not indefinitely." Naira's expression showed the calculation Thomas had seen before. 4. The tactical mind working through options. What if we went on offense? Instead of waiting for them to attack again, we find Boggs and stands alone, force a confrontation. "That is suicide," Marcus objected. "They have 20 or 30 men. We have maybe 15, including the wounded." "Numbers do not matter if you choose the battlefield," Naira countered. "Stands alone thinks like a warrior. He will camp somewhere defensible, somewhere with escape routes. If we can find his position, we can plan accordingly." Hartford studied her thoughtfully. "You are proposing an Apache-style raid. Hit them where they do not expect. Create chaos, achieve your objective, and withdraw before they can organize a response." "Yes. It could work, or it could get you killed." Thomas stepped closer to Naira, ignoring the pain in his side. "It is better than sitting here waiting for the next attack. At least if we act, we control the timing." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the shift from defense to offense. Finally, Hartford nodded. "I will send scouts to locate their camp. When we know where they are, we plan the raid. But we do this smart, not reckless. Military precision, not desperate courage." They spent the rest of the night preparing. The wounded were tended, weapons cleaned and loaded, supplies gathered. Maria Hartford moved through the house with quiet efficiency, providing coffee and food, asking no questions about the violence that had shattered her home's peace. As dawn approached, Thomas found Naira standing alone in the courtyard, staring at the blood-soaked ground where men had died fighting over documents and testimony. He approached quietly and stood beside her. "Regretting any of this yet?" She shook her head. "No, but I am thinking about Swiftwater, about how he died trying to protect our land. If we fail, his death will be forgotten and the land will still be stolen. That terrifies me more than dying." Thomas took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Then we do not fail. We find Boggs and stands alone. We end this threat, and we make sure Judge Whitmore has everything he needs to bring them to justice." Naira turned to face him, and in the pre-dawn light her face showed exhaustion and determination in equal measure. "I love you, Thomas Brennan. I did not plan to. I thought this was just survival. But somewhere between burying your cow and fighting in this courtyard, you became the person I cannot imagine living without." The words hit Thomas with more force than any bullet. He pulled her close, kissing her with all the pent-up emotion of weeks spent dancing around truth. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I love you too. And when this is over, we are going back to that ranch and building the life we both deserve. Children, peace, a future that does not involve constant fear of death. Promise?" "I promise." Hartford's scouts returned 2 hours later with information. Boggs and Stands Alone had established camp in a canyon 15 miles south, positioned defensively but arrogantly, assuming the ranch would remain on the defensive. What about Stands alone? He is as dangerous as Boggs, maybe more. Naira answered before Hartford could. Stands alone will be with the Apache warriors, probably on the eastern rim where he can see both entrances. He will expect an attack from white men, not from another Apache. That is our advantage. You plan to go after him yourself. Yes, he knows my movements, my fighting style. I know his. This has always been between us. Better to face him directly than let him orchestrate the defense. Thomas felt his chest tighten. You are not going alone. I have to. You are white. You will be spotted immediately in the Apache section of the camp. This is my fight, Thomas. Like hell it is. We are partners, remember? That means I do not let you walk into danger without backup. Hartford cleared his throat. The lady makes a tactical point, Brennan. You would be a liability in that part of the operation. If the raid went wrong, if someone made a mistake, they could die without ever seeing their ranch again. Halfway to the canyon bend, Hartford called a halt. They dismounted and moved forward on foot, leaving two men with the horses. The approach required absolute silence now. Every footstep, every breath, every clink of metal had to be controlled. They reached the canyon's northern rim just before midnight. Below, campfires dotted the darkness, maybe 30 in total, suggesting Boggs and Stands alone had gathered even more men than the scouts reported. Thomas felt his stomach drop. The odds had just gotten worse. Hartford's hands signaled the split. His group melted away toward the south entrance, while Thomas, Naira, Marcus, and the others began the descent down the narrow northern passage. The path was treacherous, barely wide enough for single file, with loose rocks that could send you tumbling if you were not careful. Marcus hit him with a rifle butt, a calculated strike that dropped Boggs without killing him. Two of Hartford's men grabbed the unconscious agent and began dragging him toward the extraction point. But the guards had seen. Three of them opened fire, bullets whipping past Thomas's head and thudding into the tent canvas. Marcus returned fire while Thomas and Daniel grabbed Boggs and kept moving. They were exposed now, the mission compromised, survival depending on reaching the horses before the entire camp could organize pursuit. On the eastern rim, Thomas caught a glimpse of Naira. She had reached Stands Alone's position, and the two were locked in combat, a deadly dance of knives and desperate strikes. Around them, Apache warriors were realizing an infiltrator was in their midst, weapons coming up, the situation deteriorating by the second. Marcus shouted something Thomas could not hear over the gunfire. They stumbled through the dark, Boggs's weight awkward between them, bullets kicking up dirt. Behind them, Hartford's group was withdrawing as planned, their diversion having served its purpose. But Naira was still up there, still fighting Stands alone, while the camp closed in around her like a fist. Thomas made a decision that was pure instinct and probably suicidal. He shoved Boggs toward Marcus and turned back, running toward the eastern rim. "Brennan, you fool, come back!" Marcus's voice chased him, but Thomas was already gone, scrambling up the rocky slope, his rifle ready, his mind focused on one objective: reach Naira before they killed her. He arrived just as Stands Alone's blade opened a cut across Naira's shoulder. She staggered but did not fall, her own knife striking back in a move so fast Thomas barely tracked it. The Apache leader caught the blade in his side and roared in pain and rage. "He said you had gone mad, had stolen sacred objects, had brought shame to our people. But I see you fight beside your husband as warriors do. I see you bleed for truth. These are not the actions of a mad woman." Naira's voice was strained with pain and emotion. "I witnessed Stands Alone murder Swiftwater, Uncle. I took documents proving he and the white agent conspired to steal our land. That is why I ran." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading through the gathered warriors. White Eagle's face showed shock, then hardening resolve. He turned to Stands Alone and spoke in Apache, the accusation clear in his tone, even if Thomas could not understand the words. Stands Alone's response was immediate and violent. He lunged at White Eagle with his knife, trying to silence this new threat to his conspiracy. But the old man was not defenseless. He sidestepped smoothly and drove his own blade into Stands Alone's chest. A killing strike delivered with the precision of a warrior who had survived decades of conflict. Stands Alone collapsed, blood bubbling from his lips. White Eagle stood over him and spoke quietly in Apache, then turned back to Naira. He confessed with his attack. "A innocent man argues with words, not knives. The warriors have seen." The entire dynamic shifted. The Apache warriors, released from Stanzalone's authority and faced with evidence of treachery, lowered their weapons. Some looked angry, some confused, but none seemed willing to continue fighting for a leader who had just been exposed as corrupt. White Eagle helped Naira to her feet, his old hands gentle on her wounded shoulder. "You should not have run, niece. You should have come to me. I did not know who to trust." Stanzalone had allies everywhere, but not among all elders, not among those who remember that honor matters more than gold. White Eagle looked at Thomas, assessing. "You are the white man she married?" "Yes, sir." "You came back for her even though it meant probable death?" "Yes." The old man nodded slowly. "Then you understand Apache ways better than most white men. We value loyalty above all things. You have shown it, and so I will show it to you." He raised his voice, speaking to all the warriors. "This woman is under my protection. Any who harm her will answer to me in the Council of Elders. We return to our lands and tell them what happened here. The truth, not the lies Stanzalone told." The warriors began withdrawing, melting into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. Within minutes, only White Eagle remained. He spoke quietly to Naira in Apache, a conversation that excluded Thomas but clearly mattered deeply to her. When it ended, the old man gripped her hand once, nodded to Thomas, and walked away into the night. Hartford sent riders to Santa Fe with Boggs in a full report of the night's events. Hours later, Maria emerged and gave Thomas the news he had been desperate to hear. "She will live. The wound is clean and will heal if she rests and does not do anything foolish, like fight more Apache warriors." Thomas nearly collapsed with relief. Hartford caught his arm and steadied him, understanding in his eyes. "Go sit with your wife, Brennan. You have earned it." Thomas entered the room where Naira lay, her shoulder bandaged and her face pale but peaceful in sleep. He pulled a chair close and took her hand, feeling her pulse beat steady and strong beneath his fingers. They had done it, survived the impossible, retrieved the evidence, and captured the architect of the conspiracy. When Naira woke, the first thing she saw was Thomas slumped in the chair beside her bed, still holding her hand, his face marked with exhaustion and dried blood from his own wounds. She squeezed his fingers weakly, and his eyes opened immediately, alert despite the fatigue. "We made it," she whispered. "We did. White Eagle saved us. Stanzalone is dead." "I know, I remember." She shifted slightly and winced at the pain. "My uncle always was wiser than most. He will tell the truth to our people. They will know I was not a traitor. Can you go back now to your band?" Naira was quiet for a moment. "I do not know if I want to. My life is with you now, at the ranch we built together. That is home more than any place I have lived before." Thomas lifted her hand and kissed it gently. "Then that is where we will go, as soon as you can travel. Back to Hollow Ridge and the cattle and the life we started." "What about Boggs, the trial?" "Judge Whitmore will handle it. Hartford has him in custody and enough evidence to convict 10 times over. Your testimony can be given by deposition if needed. You do not have to face him in court." Relief showed on her face. "Good. I am done with violence and conspiracies. I want to raise cattle and build fences and sleep without wondering who might kill me tomorrow. That can be arranged." They stayed at Hartford's ranch for 2 weeks while Naira healed and Judge Whitmore built his case. The investigation moved faster than expected. Boggs's hired guns, facing long prison sentences, turned on their employer with enthusiastic testimony. The documents Naira had taken provided irrefutable evidence of fraud. White Eagle traveled to Santa Fe and gave sworn testimony about Stanzalone's confession through violence. The case became a territorial scandal. 3 other Indian Bureau officials were arrested. Land transfers were nullified. The gold mining interests who had bribed Boggs found themselves under federal investigation. What had started with one Apache woman witnessing a murder had exposed corruption, reaching from isolated tribal lands to the highest levels of territorial government. Judge Whitmore visited the ranch personally to thank them. "You risked everything for justice, Mrs. Brennan. That is rare in my experience. Most people are too afraid or too practical." Naira, still recovering but stronger each day, met his gaze steadily. Justice for Swiftwater was worth the risk. He died trying to protect our land. The least I could do was make his death mean something. It meant everything. Because of you, Apache lands remain Apache lands. Because of you, corrupt officials face prison instead of promotion. That is a legacy worth building on. Whitmore turned to Thomas. Take care of her, Mr. Brennan. The territories need people with her courage. I plan to keep her far away from the territories need, Your Honor. We have a ranch to rebuild and a quiet life to live. Whitmore smiled. Somehow I doubt your life will ever be completely quiet, but I wish you peace nonetheless. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow in October and temperatures that froze the water trough solid before noon. Thomas and Naira worked through the cold, preparing the ranch for the brutal months ahead. The cattle were fat and healthy, the barn was weatherproof, and the cabin had been reinforced with extra insulation and supplies stockpiled to last until spring. But the town remained hostile. When Thomas rode into Hollow Ridge for supplies, conversations stopped and people turned away. The general store still served him, but Martha Henderson's prices had mysteriously increased for his purchases. The bank, despite having been paid in full, made him wait hours for simple transactions while other customers were served immediately. Thomas endured it all without complaint. He had faced worse than petty cruelty from small-minded people. But he worried about Naira, about what would happen when she needed medical help for the birth. We are not going to tolerate an Apache settlement this close to Hollow Ridge. You are putting all of us in danger. The only danger comes from people like you who cannot see past old hatreds. Thomas's voice was hard as iron. My wife's uncle helped stop a war by exposing corruption. Her people are at peace. If you start trouble, it will be you breaking that peace, not us. Kern spat into the snow. You will regret this, Brennan. Mark my words. He rode away, but the threat lingered. That night, Thomas, Naira, Marcus, and the others discussed what to do. The consensus was simple. Stay alert, defend if attacked, but do not provoke. They were in the right legally and morally. Let the town make the first move if they were foolish enough. Christmas came and went with little celebration. Naira was uncomfortable now, the baby active and her body strained by the pregnancy. Thomas stayed close, hyper-aware of every wince and shift in her expression. He had nightmares about Rebecca's death, waking in cold sweats while Naira slept peacefully beside him. The storm hit on January 3rd, arriving without warning as a wall of white that erased the world. Wind screamed across the plains, driving snow horizontal and dropping temperatures so fast that exposed skin froze in minutes. They had perhaps an hour of warning before the full fury hit, just enough time to secure the cattle and bolt themselves inside. Thomas woke before dawn on the second day of the storm to find Naira sitting upright in bed, her hand pressed to her swollen belly and her face tight with pain. It is time, she said, her voice controlled but strained. Fear spiked through Thomas like lightning. Now, during this, babies come when they come, not when we want them to. Another contraction hit, and she breathed through it, the pain visible despite her control. Get Marcus, I will need help. Thomas gripped her hands so tight he thought he might break her bones, but she did not complain, just pushed harder, her body straining with everything she had left. And then, a cry. High and clear and furious, a new voice announcing itself to the world. Daniel lifted the baby, a tiny girl with dark hair and skin that held both her parents' heritage. He cleaned her quickly and placed her on Naira's chest. She is perfect. Strong lungs, good color, healthy. Naira looked down at their daughter, tears streaming down her face for the first time since Thomas had known her. She touched the baby's tiny hand, watched those impossibly small fingers wrap around her own, and something in her expression transformed from warrior to mother in a single heartbeat. Thomas knelt beside the bed, his own vision blurred with tears. He reached out and gently touched his daughter's head, feeling the impossibly soft skin, the rapid pulse of new life. We did it. She is here. Afraid of losing you like I lost Rebecca. Afraid I would fail you both. Naira shifted to look at him, her face exhausted but radiant. You did not fail. You stood beside me, gave me strength when I needed it. That is what partnership means. Not saving each other, but making each other stronger. Hope made small noises against Naira's chest, rooting for food. They watched in wonder as she found what she needed and began to nurse, this tiny life drawing sustenance from her mother with pure instinct. She is ours, Thomas said, the reality still sinking in. Part of both of us, a bridge between worlds. More than that, she is proof that new things can grow from old conflicts, that love can build where hate tried to destroy. Naira's eyes were beginning to close, exhaustion finally claiming her. Promise me something, Thomas. Anything. Promise that we will raise her to know both her heritages, not to choose between them, but to honor both. To be strong like Apache women and gentle like the best of white culture. To know she comes from survivors who refuse to bow. Thomas kissed her forehead gently. I promise she will know everything. Your courage, your people's wisdom, the fight we made to build this life. And she will know she is loved beyond measure. Naira smiled and let sleep take her, secure in the knowledge that she had survived, that hope was healthy, that the future they had fought for was now crying softly in her arms. The storm cleared by morning. Thomas stood at the window holding hope while Naira slept, watching the sun break through clouds and paint the snow-covered ranch in shades of gold and pink. Marcus joined him, looking at the baby with the expression of someone seeing a miracle. She is beautiful, Thomas. You and Naira made something perfect. We made something worth fighting for, worth surviving for. Thomas adjusted Hope's blanket, protecting her from the draft. Thank you for being here. For everything. Where else would we be? You are family now. Over the following weeks, word spread through Hollow Ridge about the birth. Reactions were mixed. Some people muttered about half-breeds and miscegenation. Others simply shrugged and went about their business. But a few surprised Thomas. Martha Henderson appeared at the ranch one afternoon, carrying a basket of food and baby clothes. She stood awkwardly at the door, clearly uncomfortable but determined. My daughter died in childbirth 3 years ago, she said without preamble. I know what it is like to fear that loss. When I heard your wife survived, She paused, struggling. I may not approve of your choices, Mr. Brennan, but I am glad she lived. No woman should die bringing life into the world. She thrust the basket at Thomas and left before he could respond. It was not acceptance, not friendship, but it was something. A crack in the wall of hostility, small but significant. He worked harder, planned more carefully, and found himself imagining Hope as a young woman, strong, educated, free to choose her own path. One evening in May, they sat on the porch watching the sunset while Hope slept inside. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The barn stood solid and weatherproof. The fences were strong. Everything they had built through sweat and blood and desperate courage had taken root and flourished. Do you ever regret it? Thomas asked. That day you appeared in my collapsed barn and made your impossible proposal? Naira leaned against his shoulder. Never, not once. You gave me a life when I had none. Gave me love when I had forgotten what it felt like. Gave me hope. She smiled at the double meaning. What about you? Regrets? Thomas thought about the man he had been. Broken, defeated, waiting to be erased. Then he thought about who he had become. Father, husband, partner, survivor. Only that I did not bury my cow faster. Then you might have appeared 5 minutes sooner. Naira laughed, the sound carrying across the ranch they had built together. Inside, Hope stirred and made small sounds. Naira rose to tend to her, but Thomas caught her hand. I love you. I know I say it often now, but I need you to hear it again. I love you for who you are, for what you have made me become, for the family we created against every odd. She kissed him softly. I love you too, Thomas Brennan. My husband, my partner. The man who chose to stand when standing seemed impossible. They went inside together, closing the door on the fading light. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more of the endless labor that ranching demanded. But tonight they had each other, had hope, had the home they had defended and the future they had earned.